Welcome to our podcast on the Catholic intellectual tradition. Our guest today is Dr. Duane Armitage of the Philosophy Department of the University of Scranton. So welcome, Duane.
Thank you, Steve.
So could you start off by telling us about your own education?
Sure. So I did a bachelor's degree in philosophy and theology at the University of Scranton. Graduated 2005. Then I did a master's degree in philosophy from Boston College. Graduated 2007. Then I took a year off and was a bouncer and a funeral director, and part-time. And then did my PhD at a school in New York City called the New School for Social Research, and I graduated in 2012.
So your first two schools, your undergraduate and the master's degree, were both Catholic schools and Jesuit schools.
Yeah.
So you were educated in the Catholic Jesuit tradition, but your PhD school was decidedly not in the Catholic or Jesuit tradition. Could you differentiate between their outlooks on education?
Oh, completely different. Well, actually, it's interesting. The differences between the two was stark in 2010, 2008 when I started there. Now they're starting to blend a little bit more. And what I mean by that is when I was at Scranton in BC, in Scranton, it was really pretty hardcore moderate. It wasn't as political, very solidly grounded in the historical tradition, the Western canon, at least philosophy and theology and these kind of things, humanities. When I went to the new school, very Marxist, very Freudian, and very political. Everything was political, and also very Freudian, and not really. There was an emphasis on the history, but only as it could be sort of used for political battles, so to speak. What's interesting though now is I'm starting to see that leak into a lot of the discourse, not just at the University of Scranton in humanities, but in the humanities in general, and in the pop culture. And it's on Twitter. Like people are talking on Twitter like they talked at the new school in 10 years ago, which is really interesting. Very Marxist, very activist, very political, this kind of thing. Which to some degree is good, I think, but I think it goes too far.
So do you think that their view of philosophy was simply as a tool and not as something in itself?
Karl Marx has a famous quote from the German ideology. Up until now, philosophers have only interpreted the world. The goal is to change the world. So right there, that's the activism that's in Marx. And of course, he thought religion was an opiate for the masses. He says religion is the opiate for the masses. Why? Because it numbs you from the anger you should be angry at your oppression. And if you're religious, you won't get angry, and then you won't violently revolt. So the religious tradition, I think, and Marx would agree, but Catholic tradition, obviously for different reasons, anger and violent revolt isn't the sort of first step you want in or at least that's not the point of education. And I think that was the point of education, but it's becoming that now. I think certainly at the new school, the point of education was to tune you up so that you were ready to revolt. And you had this at the new school. People were occupying buildings. They actually I feel like every other year the students were occupying one of the buildings in Manhattan. They actually got whoever the president was at the time. I don't remember. Oh, it was a senator, Kerry, not John Kerry, Bob Kerry maybe. He was. They got him out for war crimes or something like that. So it was very politically motivated. Although now I'm starting to see that again at the University of Scranton, or I'm starting to see it at the Jesuit schools, talking like this and this kind of thing.
So how do you think both of those educations affected you personally? In your own views towards what philosophy is and should be?
Yeah, that's interesting. I was very taken by the Jesuit tradition and the Catholic intellectual tradition at Scranton, particularly because I came in sort of religious, but I didn't know what to do with it. And I was almost on the verge of losing my faith when I came at the University of Scranton. I was 18 as a freshman in 2001. That was the year of 9/11. So I'm there a couple of weeks and 9/11 happens. I was on the verge of losing my faith, and I thought, just because I didn't have any way to understand it. And I started, about 10 minutes into my intro philosophy class with Bill Rao, I'm like, oh my God. What is this? Athens and Jerusalem are married? What is this way of thinking about? I mean, that's really what the Catholic intellectual tradition is. It's the marriage of Athens and Jerusalem. But it really gave me a way to explore my faith intellectually. Same thing at Boston College. It was very similar in terms of atmosphere and ethos and things like that. The new school turned me off from philosophy, and I sort of kept away from it. And it almost, in a certain way, sharpened what I believed, because I knew, that's too extreme. I don't believe that. And there's a lot in that tradition, by the way, if you want to call it that, the Marxist Freudian tradition, the tradition of the New School, which is really the tradition of the German Frankfurt School. So the Frankfurt School for Social Research, New School for Social Research. But it helped in that sense. And and it influenced my research a little bit, because I'm obsessed with the reductio ad absurdum, taking the opposite position and reducing it to absurdity. And I think it's very good that people not only, maybe they don't have to go to school or work at places they disagree with, but certainly read philosophy and read arguments that they disagree with. And so that's how the New School shaped me. It refined what I already thought, I think, in some ways.
So do you see the New School as a rejection both of Jerusalem and Athens, rather than saying that they're married, but just both of them?
Absolutely, and explicitly so. So it obviously rejects Jerusalem for religious reasons, but it sort of takes as standard the Nietzschean dictum, God is dead. So there's no God didn't exist. I was not just at the New School, by the way. I didn't really understand what Nietzsche believed or what Nietzsche meant by God is dead as a cultural diagnosis until I moved to New York City, where no one believed in God, and it was ridiculous if you said you believed in God. I showed up the first day and said I was Catholic, and they went, "Ha ha! No, come on, really?" They didn't believe me. So, but also too, yes, they do reject Jerusalem because they have it's sort of, and this is in Marx as well and Freud, this idea that there's any objective truth, or the Western tradition is considered logocentric, or as Derrida says, phallogocentric. So that it believes in not just truth but rationality and intelligibility, all the things that come under critique from Nietzsche and the postmodernists. That makes it fascist, and I'm not kidding. This idea that truth and the belief that the world is structured according to intelligible essences or intelligible realities, that is considered a very dangerous ideology, because so postmodernists think that if you think that the world has intelligibility, if you think there is objective or absolute truth, you're going to try to force it on people, and that explains the violence of the 20th century and violence in general. Yeah. So it's a rejection of both. Yeah.
Do you think that sort of mentality has as an end goal sort of an elimination of themselves, that they're arguing against their own existence as academics?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so it's no wonder then that humanities departments are diminishing, because the scientists, the mathematicians, the physicists, the biologists, they look at us and they say, "Oh, what do you guys do?" Nothing. There's nothing. There is no truth. What we do is nonsense. And they go, "Why are we paying these people?" And then the students aren't buying it either, because it just is frankly nihilism. If there's no truth and if it's very easy then to say, well, all right, if there is no truth, we might as well go with the sciences, because at least they give us something useful or technological and this kind of thing. It's self-referentially incoherent, but it's also eating itself, and it's destroying itself. It's self-destructive, I think, yeah.
So what do you see as the future of philosophy then? Do you think a lot of these departments are going to disappear in the next 50 years?
I don't know. I hope not. I mean, I hope. It's a good question. I've thought a lot about this. I don't know. I think it depends on where the crowd, where the mob in America is. And I mean mob in the good and the bad sense, that I don't know if we've had enough of it, or, if wokeism goes along with this. I don't know if it's going to go too far where people are going to go, this is enough. Let's go back to the way it was done. Or, it will destroy itself. I'm not sure. I think we'll know in maybe the next 5 years, I think. I don't know where it's going to go. If it continues on the path it's on, then there's no justification for it. It can't justify itself, because what is philosophy? Philosophy is concerned with the meta-empirical, or the metaphysical. That's what Aristotle says. Philosophy is metaphysics. First philosophy is metaphysics. Well, if there isn't any metaphysical, Aristotle says this in I think it's book 4 of the Metaphysics. He says if immaterial reality, if God does not exist, or if immaterial reality does not exist, then physics is first philosophy. Right? He didn't understand mathematics, otherwise he would have said mathematics is first philosophy. But he's right. If there's no metaphysical truths, then why don't we all just agree with science, eliminate the humanities, and make everything a professional school? Now, of course, you do that, you're going to break the human spirit, or there's something I hope that in the human being, because human beings are just by nature philosophical. We're obsessed with the metaphysical. We're obsessed with theological questions, with questions of purpose and meaning. To eliminate philosophy, I don't think will be possible, because human beings, it's like a stain that won't come out. I'm not sure they'll ever be able to eliminate it, in that sense, that the human spirit is too powerful for that. That's what I hope, anyway.
So is this a natural consequence, you think, of the divorce from the divine? If you don't have a view of human beings as some kind of connection to the divine, then they become sort of irrelevant, and their thoughts become irrelevant. Exactly. I mean, I don't know if there's a better way to say it than that, but it's sort of like Nietzsche says, Christianity, or you could substitute any religion there, but Christianity especially is Platonism for the masses, or Platonism for the people. And it's true. It goes back to what I was saying there. What's Platonism? Platonism is the belief in the metaphysica, the beyond the physical. And religion operates that there are two worlds. It's bizarre how clear that is in the New Testament as well. There's the other world, there's the world of the unseen, and the visible world, the invisible and the visible world, the supersensible and the sensible. And if God is dead, if there's no God,
then there's no metaphysical, and then there's no point to it. Nietzsche saw this, by the way, which is why he rejected not only God. Nietzsche says very famously, I'm an atheist by instinct. I hate it. I can't understand it. But he recognized that if he believed in not just God and religion and philosophy, but also science, physics, and mathematics, that God would creep in the back door, because those mathematics he thought was metaphysics. And I think he's right. I think you agree with this, because it's a kind of Platonism. He was very wary of that. And he recognized we need to eliminate the idea that there's any kind of objective ontological status to intelligibility, and operate as radical empiricists who believe in a social constructionist view of the world. That is, that any intelligibility we have in the world is put on there by us, by the mind, which is very Kantian, and any meaning is just imposed on the world by the mind. Yeah. So
if the postmodernists read something like Aquinas, how do they view that? Do they just find it all to be nonsensical, or...?
That's a good question. It's kind of like, where do I begin? If I'm a postmodernist reading Aquinas, they'd probably say, where to begin? Well, they would reject the idea that there's any objective order to the world. I'd say the main critique of it. They would say that Aquinas is applying useful but false rational categories like causality. For example, Aquinas proves God in 5 ways, and 3 of the 5 ways, I think, 3 of the 5 ways. Is it 3 or maybe it's 4 of the 5? It doesn't matter. Use the principle of sufficient reason, the idea that every effect has a cause, that you can trace, that you can order the world. And Aquinas, says, well, look, what's the ultimate explanation for the world? What's the first cause? Postmodernists would say, well, you're just applying a useful principle to the world so we can make sense of it and order it and control it, well beyond its application. Well, which is what Kant says essentially. And of course they would think the idea of using reason to prove theological things to be ridiculous, because there's no product there. There's a kind of pragmatism in postmodernism. Well, you can use these rational categories so far as they're useful, but there's no such thing as knowledge in itself. Yeah. And matter of fact, it's not even that. It's not even just a critique. It's also an ethical critique, which is, if you use those rational categories, not only are you stupid, but you're going to be violent. You're going to end up killing people. This is the interesting thing about postmodernism, that it has a kind of tacit, which I would say is Judeo-Christian ethic to it, namely the social justice ethic, the ethic of concern for victims or concern for the weak. Postmodernism is very much concerned for that. Don't victimize people, and what victimizes people is rational categories and reason and essentialism or absolute truth. Problem is they can't justify their own ethic, which is very interesting. I'm sort of rambling on here, but it goes back to your point about the self-destruction part of it, that it ends up being more Christian than it realizes. And Nietzsche saw this, by the way. He was very much aware that the socialists, and I didn't use the term Marxist yet, but the socialists were still kind of stuck in a Jewish and Christian morality that was going to end up violent. Anyway.
So you think that the people who would espouse such ideas, do they see themselves as living a moral life, or they just simply don't care if they're living a moral life?
I think, no. Which the irony is, I think they see themselves as hyper-moral. So, and it's kind of like if you were to talk to, let's say a Marxist or someone who's atheistic. I haven't met too many atheists who are Nietzschean who would say, yeah, there's no God, there's no good or evil, Harry, only power, what Voldemort says in the first Harry Potter. No, they'll say, matter of fact, God is a bad idea because it hurts people. That's what Richard Dawkins says, and Sam Harris, and the sort of, they were the new atheists, I get the old atheists, but they'll say God is a very dangerous idea because it leads to victimization. Now, but the irony is that the victimization ethic, the mercy ethic, is Christian. So, I think they would see themselves as being hyper-moral to a certain degree. It's interesting that a Catholic thinker named René Girard just died in 2015. He argues that what we're seeing now with atheism and with Nietzsche's diagnosis of the death of God is a kind of hyper-caricatural Christian ethic, which radicalizes and extends the Christian ethic of concern for victims to a kind of radical degree. And of course leads to its own kind of violence, because if you look at the violence in the 20th century, the Marxist violence of the left-wing violence of the 20th century had a lot to do with perceived victimizers. So you can't, obviously, victimization is bad, and we need to start looking for who the victimizers are. And so that's sort of what you have now in the most extreme versions of left-wing, I guess, cancel culture in America now. Not to say that there isn't problems on the right as well. I was on a talk show, like a radio show about 2 years ago, and I said the left is more, actually, and it was a right-wing radio show, and I said the left is more Christian than the right. And the guy stopped me, whoa, what do you mean by that? Because a lot of our viewers are, conservative. And I said, well, they're using the Christian ethic at least. Extreme versions of the right go just fascist, and they go very, nationalist and things like this, where just let the weak die off. Whereas the radicals on the left really take an extreme version of the concern for victims, such that we need to look for any possible victimizer whatsoever. Yeah.
So in that philosophy, then, is there anything that they could do that's not justified? I mean, is violence justified? Is it, if they're going to stop the victimizer, can they do absolutely anything, or is there any guard on that?
Well,
as there would be in Christian philosophy.
No, that's the thing. So, well, why was there 100 million deaths under Marxism? Why? It's interesting that why did people kill people in the name of Marxism? It's easy to see like why the Nazis did it. It was just nuts. It was racist. It was biological essentialism, biological superiority, all these things. World domination, these kind of things. But Marxism, you're like, how could people kill in such a lovely, you read Marx, I mean, some of it, and you think, oh, wow, everybody gets along, no poor, no rich, we all hold everything in common like the apostles. Where's the murder here? Well, the murder comes from, that's just not the way the world is divided, at least right now, or in any structure, really, of society. There are hierarchies, and Marxism is a kind of dissolving of hierarchies, and the people, it's just assumed that if you're in control, or if you're at the top of any hierarchy, whatever that is, you got there by cheating, and you got there by victimizing. So violence is of course justified if you've cheated your way to the top. So anybody who's successful at all, this is one of the problems that's I think leaking into the mainstream culture as well, as a critique of the meritocracy. That if someone is successful in the world, and that's not to say that there aren't people that cheat, but just ipso facto, if you're successful, you've somehow victimized and cheated your way to the top, which I don't think is true. I do think people rise to the top for various reasons, some of which might be cheating, but yeah.
So when the students first come to you as freshmen, which ideas do you think are already implanted in their head?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. So I start my intro class and my ethics class with Nietzsche, because I say, look, I know you think this class is worthless and you have your own thoughts and you don't need to read the history of philosophy, but if you've had a philosophical thought, which I'm sure you've had, somebody's thought of it before and they've thought about it more consistently and better than you did. They've probably given more than 15 minutes to it when you were, high or something, whatever they're doing. And we start with Nietzsche and the idea. All right, let's take seriously this idea that there's no God, because I think Nietzsche is very good. I think Nietzsche is the best atheist in the sense of he really takes seriously what it means for there to be no God. He says, all right, yeah, there's no God. Well, if there's no God, then there's only power. That's all. That's the way you understand the world, because there can't be any mathematics or physics or intelligibility, because then that leads back to God. Because if you're dealing with the metaphysical, you might as well put God in there. So there's only power, and if you have power divides into strong and weak, right? And Nietzsche says, why side with the weak? If there's just power, why not side with the strong? There's absolutely no reason than 2,000 years of catechesis in Judeo-Christianity. So how do you like that? You want to be an atheist? Give me a justification for siding with the weak. Nature doesn't do it. I bring this example up. I was watching on the television on Disney, because I have Disney Plus, one of these nature documentaries, and they're getting brutal. They had a flamingo on there, raising her two little birds, I guess, and she let the one die off because it was sickly. And it said, oh, now the flamingo will just give food to the stronger because it doesn't want to waste the resources. And like, nature is brutal. Human beings are these weird creatures that care about the sick, the suffering, the victim, obviously because of the influence of Jews and Christians. And Nietzsche says, well, if there's no God, what's the justification for this morality that we all just agree with? Because nobody will really disagree with this. People will say there's no such thing as truth. Then I'll say, oh, so you think victimization is okay? Or you think people that say victimization is okay, that must be, if that's their truth, it's their truth. They'll go, no, well, that's not. That's, of course, true. And then, of course, there's no reason to justify it. So Nietzsche is great. And I start with Nietzsche. So back to your question is what views are implanted in them. It's a kind of weird hybrid of Nietzschean atheism of will to power and the social constructionist theory of the world and relativism and these things, coupled with the Christian ethic, which if you take that and dust it off a little bit, and you fix a corner here, fix a corner there, that's Marxism. Power plus the Christian ethic, a power metaphysics, a metaphysics that's radically immanent, and the Judeo-Christian ethic. Yeah. And so I try to show them that this is an inconsistent ideology. You got to pick one,
So historically, this is just going back to the way the Romans viewed the world, and they viewed the strong as the weak.
Yes, yeah. Even the word virtus, power, manliness, or the Greek arete, noble, high-minded. There's no. This is interesting. I've always wondered this until very recently, maybe 5-6 years ago, as I started thinking about this in terms of Nietzsche. Why don't you see the virtue of kindness or compassion in Aristotle and Plato? You don't. You don't see it there. They talk about courage, prudence. Remember, I think we had a conversation like this maybe 20 years ago at the Jesuit residence when we said the 4 cardinal virtues were not virtues, because you could be a bad person and have those quote virtues, because they're about power and superiority. Even the word again, virtus, power. You don't see that there. And yeah, in that culture, if you said you were a victim, they'd go, who cares? Now, of course, when Christianity comes on the scene, it spreads like wildfire, first among women and slaves, and then it overtakes the world. Nietzsche saw that as the worst thing that's ever happened to Western culture. I view that as the best thing that's happened to Western culture. So, yeah, I think that's right.
The Romans and the Nazis, thousands of years later, rejected Christianity for just that reason.
Exactly. Yeah.
They found it to be effeminate and.
That's great. Yeah. Nietzsche says it's the feminization of the world, which is, and it's it's interesting to say that the two images that are most popular in Christian art are obviously the crucifixion of somebody suffering, but then the woman and child. And so Nietzsche does say that the virtues that were considered only female or feminine, mercy, kindness, compassion, warmth, these kind of things, overtake the world with the Judeo-Christian ethic. I was watching some video who was arguing that it was actually beneficial that God goes beyond gender, but that he was called Abba or Father, precisely because you'd have goddesses who would have these views, but you'd never have a male figure who had this virtue of kindness and compassion, and so that was very confusing to that world. Yeah, so and beneficial, I think, to some degree.
So do you think that the image of what we have as a hero is much different in Christianity than, say, the Roman hero was somebody who was strong, who could, it's Caesar, who can go out and just conquer a nation.
Yeah.
No one was really concerned about Caesar's purity.
Yeah.
But the Christian hero would be something quite different.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. That's why it's interesting. We have a weird hybrid because we still do want the athletic, we want athletes to be heroes and things like that. But if they do something wrong, if they break their, if they break the, like, for example, I was watching Tiger Woods, the other day, and I remember he had a sort of fall from grace because he had committed, I think he had extramarital affairs or something like that, and that, people didn't like that because it's a kind of weird hybrid that we still want the powerful athlete, but we also want them to obey the Judeo-Christian value structure, which
I think we want it to be something like Lancelot, who says, I have the strength of 10 men because my heart is pure.
Yes, yeah. That's a great point. Yeah, that's excellent.
But as we said, for the Nazis or for the Romans, the purity of the person was sort of irrelevant.
Yeah.
It was how strong they were.
Yep.
And the mentality was that you side with the strong because they are going to win.
Yes.
Not where you side with the weak because they need your protection.
Yeah, that's exactly right. What's interesting about strong and weak, that's essentially right. That sort of cliche that history is written by the winners is largely true, except for, and this is René Girard and Nietzsche's thesis, for some reason, the Jewish people survived. And they were always victimized, and they were always weak vis-a-vis the rest of the culture. And they survived, and their thoughts survived. And we get a very different ethic from the Jews, and then it's, of course, universalized with the Christians. We get this ethic that weakness matters, that we get the perspective of the victim. We get the perspective of the victim. That changes the world. It changes the world, because most people can relate to that. Most people can relate to victimization. And very few people are on top and are strong. Most people are weak. But the irony is that in nature and in the rest of the world for the longest time, that ethic, that perspective was foreign. René Girard, for example, and this is someone I worked on recently, said that if you look at mythology, ancient mythology, and the difference between Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, and mythology is that it's always the perspective of the persecutors or the powerful telling the story. So he reads, for example, the Oedipus story as this is a mob that kicked Oedipus out and blamed him for something, blamed him for incest and patricide. But in fact, and you see this, there's always a murder in these mythologies, but the person's always guilty and they get rid of them, right? And so, but what's interesting is you see almost the anti-Oedipal stuff going on in the Bible right from Genesis. So, for example, Joseph and Potiphar's wife in Genesis is an anti-Oedipal story. Joseph's innocent there. Joseph gets kicked out. Potiphar becomes a father to him. Potiphar's wife hits on him. Joseph says, no, I must not do that. And of course, we know all along as we're watching the story, he's innocent. And of course, we watch him suffer. So the same thing with, Cain and Abel. Abel's innocent. He's killed. And you see that from the very beginning. That and you have this narrative where all of a sudden the victim's perspective matters. And then you get this mercy ethic and this what we call social justice today. Yeah.
So I would just look at the story of, say, King David. King David beats Goliath simply because he's pure. And when Goliath comes at him with a sword, David says, I don't need the sword. Mm-hmm. I have the power of the Almighty God behind me.
Right. Yeah. So David's an interesting character, isn't he? Because there's the hero who's flawed and chided for being a victimizer. So when he sleeps with Bathsheba and he kills Uriah, Nathan comes to him and outrages David Nathaniel, his name is, right? Nathaniel, yeah. Outrages David because he, I forget what the parable is, but it's something about you victimized this person, and David's outraged, and he goes, that man is you. About David's, defeating Goliath and things like this. It's always in this context of purity, like you're saying, holiness, and mercy. Yeah.
But so in David and the Old Testament tradition, there's the additional thing of God, right? So that virtue, true virtue, not the Roman view of it, but the Christian view of it, I'm saying, is in your closeness to God. So it's not simply by not victimizing, but in living a holy and upright life.
Right. But that righteousness would be tied to concern for the poor, the orphan, the widow, things like that is very revolutionary. It's very, very odd. Yeah, you couldn't really, I see what you're saying, you couldn't really emulate the Greek gods, Although, Zeus is doing all kind of things, he's committing, rape and these other things, and striking people down for arbitrary reasons. The Hebrew God gets angry, but he only gets angry for righteous reasons, so to speak. Now, it's interesting. Plato and Aristotle did have this sense of trying to imitate God, but they couldn't really see it morally. They only saw it intellectually, which is a step, I think, that we imitate God sort of in philosophizing and thinking and in metaphysics and things like that. There are spots littered throughout the Platonic dialogues, however, that do talk about the way you're talking about, that righteousness and holiness and things like this are ways in which getting closer to God.
Do you think if Aristotle and Plato had a more well-defined version of one God, that it would have changed their philosophy at all?
I don't know. I guess absolutely. I think because, the reason I say I don't know, is because you do have it sort of there with the story of Socrates, where, Socrates he's innocent and he's persecuted by a mob, and you see that, but it's confusing. So the tradition is that they were like the pre-Christians. They had the logos, but the general logos that we can all have. But if they had seen the revelation in Christ, they would have converted, so to speak. Yeah. But it's not a full-blown, the ethic there, God is very mysterious, doesn't talk a lot about God other than in abstract ways with Plato and in Aristotle.
But nevertheless, they don't attach a personhood to God in the same way that the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Yeah, no, not officially they don't. Although there are these remarks scattered throughout Aristotle and Plato which seem to do that. But they don't they don't seem to ever tie that together with what their larger metaphysical philosophy is on God. So they for example, Aristotle says, quite clearly, God doesn't have anything to do with the world because he or it can't come down and be touched by this material stuff because he's pure activity or pure intellectual activity. Yeah.
Which is certainly a criticism of Christianity from other religions that they don't like the idea of God becoming incarnate. Certainly, Islam doesn't want to think of God becoming incarnate.
Yeah.
While they accept Christ as a prophet, they don't accept him as God.
Yeah. Well, that God could become not just incarnate, but associate with sinners and become powerless and die ultimately is bizarre. The crucifixion makes no sense if you logically. One of my favorite thinkers he's not strictly speaking in the Catholic intellectual tradition because he's Lutheran, but he's Soren Kierkegaard. His picture is right there. He talks about the best parts of the Christian faith are paradoxes and absurdities, not in the sense of irrational, but as super rational, but that they draw the mind in and awaken the heart and this kind of thing, because we know they're true, not in a subjective sense, but in the kind of the way St. Paul says, the way in which God's love or God's peace passes understanding, this kind of thing. But the incarnation is one of them, the crucifixion is another, the Trinity is another. Kierkegaard actually says that if you look at just the concept of a human being, never mind God becoming a human being, but the human being relating to God, that's an absurdity in and of itself. And then, of course, God takes that absurdity that God would relate to us human beings, care about us human beings, and by becoming a human being, he sort of takes the paradox and becomes that paradox. And so Christianity is a religion that deals with what I would call necessary paradoxes, because if you don't have these paradoxes, these things that defy reason, nothing makes sense in the world, because you can't live,
Islam takes a different view of the crucifixion in that they accept that Christ was crucified, but they don't accept that he suffered.
Well, it's interesting.
He's separate from the suffering, and because God just protected him. But for us, for Christians, for Catholics, this is the fact that he was suffering on the cross is an absolute necessity to the
There's a heresy called Docetism that God, from the Greek seem, that Christ only seemed to die or seemed to suffer. That was a big problem, and there were from the early on. So before Islam. people were worried about that how could God suffer? How could he have any, because this is what metaphysicians say, like Aristotle and Plato, that God can't undergo anything. God can't even have pathos. So he can't suffer or undergo anything.
How can he be less virtuous than Caesar, right?
Right.
How could he suffer and not be able to just invoke his own armies and conquer?
Right. So the one of the things in the Eastern tradition is the kenosis, the self-emptying. Why would God do that? How could God do that? And it's a mystery why God would do it. It's always, it's bizarre why God would let it. I mean, every Easter I go through the, meditations on the Passion and things, and that thought pops into, I think, everybody's head. Why is he letting this happen? It's because he's not just dying; he's being tortured to death and ridiculed and mocked and humiliated. Crucifixion was a very humiliating way to die. You'd die naked, for everyone to see, and you'd be humiliated. And it was the utter destruction of your name and reputation. And to die like a common criminal like that, it's bizarre, but it's very moving. But yeah, you're right. Islam doesn't agree with that, and there's also a tradition in Islam. I think this is in the Quran, that Jesus was actually switched out with Simon of Cyrene. That he wasn't actually crucified, depending on, I think, maybe the interpretations or whatever, but that he actually wasn't even crucified, that Simon of Cyrene was crucified and Jesus was just taken up because this. But again, you can see there this aversion to God suffering, and yeah.
So later on, when Christianity went from the Romans went from persecuting Christianity to marrying Christianity in some sense under Constantine, do you think that affected the way that we viewed virtue, and that they tried to meld the Greco-Roman ideal with the Judeo-Christian ideal?
Yeah, I think so, and that's largely the source of Christian virtue ethics. Especially in Aquinas and Scholasticism and things like this. And Augustine tries to do that as well. I think that was a good thing. I think one of the benefits of Christianity and the genius of Christianity is that it can baptize anything and it can adapt to any culture. So for example, if I were to convert to a very strict version of Judaism or Islam, I might change my cultural appearance. I'd have to learn Hebrew or Arabic. I might dress different. I might, grow a beard or something like this, wear certain different. Whereas Christianity, I think what made it so effective, and you can say this from an atheistic perspective as well. I think Richard Dawkins actually said this. It's very good host, or a very good virus to affect people in this way. Dawkins calls it the virus because it can adapt to anything. It can take on any culture, it can take on any cultural practices that it finds itself in the midst of, and it did that precisely with the Roman Empire, and of course in the East as well, and as it spreads, I'm sure you'll get as Christian, in the Far East and things like that as well. But yeah, and I think that's a good thing, even though it's not, they're not totally, this deeper question about that Tertullian asked, early church father named Tertullian, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? He was very much against it, and there's been criticisms of it. Martin Luther was very critical of Greek. Martin Luther said, really, the Reformation, if you read his stuff right before 1517, when he nails the theses, or supposedly did, in 1515, his commentary on Romans, he's already criticizing the Greek philosophical tradition and the wedding of Athens and Jerusalem. So this has not been an easy marriage, but I think it's been beneficial, even if it's not perfectly synthesizable, or you're not able to have a complete harmony or perfection, but it does give us what I think is essential to the Catholic intellectual tradition is the harmony between faith and reason, which is stressed over and over. Ever since I remember that being shocking for me when I came to the University of Scranton and hearing that faith and reason don't contradict each other. That's I thought, what are you talking about? You have science. That science is saying something different. And then I realized I just didn't know what I was talking about. Like people will say things very ignorantly, like. I think, I can't remember when Humani Generis came out, maybe the 50s, the 40s, I don't know, the idea that when the Catholic Church accepted evolution. This is 1950s or something. And people will still say things 70 years later, 80 years later, the Church doesn't believe in evolution. I'm thinking, what? No, what are you talking about? This is, and scientific advancements all the time are being accepted by the Church. Now, sometimes slowly, with Galileo and things like that. It was a little, but nevertheless, yeah. That's one of the things that draws me to the Catholic intellectual tradition, which I think comes from the initial marriage between Athens and Jerusalem, namely the harmony between faith and reason. Yeah.
So how do you think the Protestant Reformation affected this whole philosophical ideal?
Well, this is what I did actually. My dissertation, my first book was on this. Martin Luther and his relationship to this question of reason. Luther famously said, reason is the devil's whore. And so reason needs to be deconstructed. The word deconstruction actually comes from Luther. We need to deconstruct the marriage of faith and reason, or the marriage of Athens and Jerusalem, and faith alone. This idea that faith beyond understanding, separate from understanding, needs to dominate, because Luther thought that if you bought the Aristotelian ethic, and this is interesting, the ethic of habituation, the idea that you can inculcate virtues through repeated effort and habituation, that you would end up removing any need for there to be grace. And so really, with Luther's emphasis, obviously everybody knows this, that it's faith alone. Salvation is or justification by faith alone, sola fide. Luther didn't find any reason to accept an ethic beyond that, and so Luther says sin and sin boldly kind of thing. He was very critical of not just the ethic but the metaphysics as well, because he thought it took away from the grace of God and this kind of thing, and the human being's relationship to God. And there is a sense in which that's true, and this was brought up more recently by Pascal. What does the God of the philosophers have to do with Yahweh or Jesus? Because the God of the philosophers is very remote. You can't dance and sing before this God. You can't pray to this God. And there's a point there that if you take your only way of understanding God in this abstract metaphysical sense, well, obviously that's silly. And yeah, it's true. If you think you can perfectly justify yourself by human effort, you're wrong. But I think that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I think, what happened with Luther. But yeah, to answer your question, yes, and explicitly so, it's in Luther that we need to divorce these two things, because reason, if taken very seriously, will usurp grace. Yeah.
Do you think that affects then the way you view human beings? In other words, if a God who doesn't dance or sing, then we view anything that makes us sort of human as something negative.
That's interesting. Yeah. What do you mean by that? Do you mean
I mean, if we view God as sort of not having the properties that.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So if the philosopher God, he doesn't care if you're dancing and singing in front of him, right? He doesn't care about this because he's above all of this.
Yeah.
And it denigrates then many of the things that make us human.
Yeah.
So it gets to the point of, say, for example, in the Protestant Reformation, they denounced what they refer to as smells and bells.
Yeah.
Right, as being unnecessary to the faith.
Yeah.
Which I see as it's like being in love with somebody. Could you still be in love with them and never give them a hug?
Right.
Well, sure. You still can be in love with them and never give them a hug. But why would you want to?
Right.
Because as human beings, that feeling, that hug, the physical manifestation of that love is something that is very meaningful. So why would you want to do away with the smells and bells when this is the way that human beings work?
Yeah.
Right? There seems to be no reason why we should strip things down to only the absolute necessity.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting, too, that, it's precisely what Catholicism doesn't do, I think, which is the irony here, that, our faith is very much embodied. It's very sacramental and this kind of thing. And so I think that's partly why Catholicism was well, now, of course, what Luther was objecting to with indulgences and abuses and things like that was justified. But I think for the Protestantism, and, I'm not criticizing it here, but it was very much an intellectualist movement, more of the intelligentsia doing this, and and it coincided with the printing press, I think, to some degree, that the Bible was being read and all that stuff was good. But I think what insulated or protected Catholicism from this, ever having to worry about the God of the philosophers being remote is the sacraments and the embodied liturgy and things like that. I always think about this too, that Catholicism is really a religion that developed in an illiterate culture to a certain degree. I mean, the priests could read and things like this, but a lot of people couldn't read back then. So you had to have this majestic, ceremonial, liturgical, sacramental world. And so I don't think that was the last thing I think people would be worried about, would be like someone praying before a God who was too remote or something like that. Now, I suppose you can critique some of the practices in Catholicism as they can become mechanical, but that's not been my experience of them, these sacramental practices and things like that. If you look at like some of the abuses in the Middle Ages, like, all right, say 15 Hail Marys and pay us this money and this person will get out of purgatory or something like that. But those are very particular abuses of what I think is otherwise a good system. Yeah.
Could you compare what you think the philosophical tradition of the Western Catholic Church is with the Eastern Catholic Church? I mean, the Eastern Catholic Church seems more Platonic.
Yes, yeah.
Not affected by scholasticism in the least.
Yeah, the Eastern Catholic... So I have a deep interest in Eastern Catholicism or Eastern Christianity, spirituality in particular. I would say the main difference is there's a sense of not trying to solve everything and not categorize everything in the East. And it's interesting that Catholicism, or the Latin Church, has this motto, lex orandi, lex credendi, or what is the legem credendi, lex statuit supplicandi. The law of belief is affected by the law of prayer, or something like this, or the way we pray affects belief. That's not always true, but it is true in the East. The East really built its metaphysical system. I'm thinking of Palamas and Gregory Palamas. About the energies and essences of God. This idea, I was surprised by this, comes out of mysticism. So you had basically, so it works from the ground up in the East, which I think is great. It doesn't always do that in the West. But for example, you had monks praying the Jesus prayer and experiencing the light of God and feeling a fusion with this light. And the question was, well, working backwards from that, how is that possible? Is that God they're fusing with, the essence of God? And then Palamas is like, no, but it's the energies of God which are eternally surrounding His essence. And that's how the mysticism is possible. So it really works backwards like that, and I really like that about the Eastern Church. That it's very mystical and mystical oriented, and it's very focused on Jesus too. And I think it's great that the Western Church is focused on Mary and things, but not the way the Eastern Church has the Jesus prayer. The Western Church has the Rosary, which both bead forms of prayers and things like this. Did you know this too, by the way? The word bead comes from the word to pray. I didn't know that. I just read that recently because people were always praying with beads. But I would say there's a Christocentrism in the East that I'm particularly drawn to. But to answer your question, the East is more mystical in the sense that it starts there with mysticism and it builds its theology around that. Now, I'm sure you could argue that the West does as well, but it seems like it doesn't seem to be the case all the time.
Do you think the Protestant Reformation has pulled the West away from the East? In an attempt to respond to the Protestant questions.
You mean like Trent?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think what we see. So I don't really know much about what the liturgy or what thought thinking was like, or what the liturgy in particular was like before Trent. Because we had the Latin Mass and things like this. But I guess it looks something like that. But the West sort of doubled down on things to distinguish themselves from the Lutherans and from the Protestants, things like this. And I wonder if that affected that scholasticism and things like this. The overemphasis on certain mechanical procedures, or the overemphasis on rationality and rational categories at the expense of other things, to sort of say, no, this is the line and the Protestants have crossed it, kind of thing.
So mainline Protestantism has all but disappeared in some sense.
Yeah.
And has been replaced with the fundamentalist view.
What's interesting, in the last, I'd say 2 years maybe, the evangelical fundamentalism, if you read that, it does very much look true to what Luther imagined. An emphasis on a personal relationship with God, on feeling, and all this stuff is good. Personal relationship with Jesus, I'm a fan of, But now it's interesting. I think the problem with that is, which was the problem for me, and this is circling back to what we began with, is I originally had an experience like that at an evangelical church when I was 17, and I didn't know what to do with it. And eventually I was on the verge of that sort of flame going out because I had no way to process it. You're seeing that in the evangelical church now, particularly among younger people in the church. They're becoming atheists and Marxists. I see it every day on Facebook. One of my friends, even my age, so I'm 39. A couple of my friends are like, I'm leaving the church. I just can't relate to it. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense how this could happen. How this could happen. Stuff. There's really no way to work this out other than what's the Bible say. And so Catholicism is criticized by this, but in the by Protestantism in particular, but in, for example, the Second Vatican Council's document, Dei Verbum, it says, tradition and scripture make up one sacred deposit in the Word of God, which means that it's not just sola scriptura. We have a living tradition here and a lot to draw on in order to process the experience of God. So that was, I think, the thing that most drew me to Catholicism is that it's literal, Catholicism means universal, kata holon. There are a lot of ways to understand what the experience of God is, and there are a lot of ways to process that experience, and there's no sort of one way if it doesn't fit this sort of mold. Yeah.
Do you have a particular devotion to the Jesus prayer and hesychism and that sort of?
Yeah, I like that.
How do you view that as a philosopher? Where do you see the
philosophical
philosophical underpinnings of sort of a hesychastic prayer?
Yeah, so that's interesting. There's a lot to hesychasm, and I don't, you know much more about this than I do. Again, what I think is cool about it is the idea that the metaphysics comes after it, and so the experience is what you're looking for. And it's interesting that the Hesychastic tradition, if you read, I've read a lot of the Philokalia and the Fathers on the Jesus Prayer, and they say this weird thing over and over again, which is take your attention out of your mind and put it in your heart, which is interesting. Where it's almost, move your attention to the heart.
Yeah, unphilosophical.
Unphilosophical, yeah. But it's sort of this sense of there's a very real, and you find this a little bit in Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, a kind of someone walking you through the steps of how to experience God and what that's like. But I find it to be much more consistent, and it's amazing that people are saying this hundreds of years apart, and they're all saying the same thing. When you start to pray this way, watch for this, watch for spiritual pride, watch for lights, the mysticism is very detailed, and it's otherworldly. There's almost a sense in which mysticism is encouraged in a way. Karl Rahner had said, in the 60s or something, that every Catholic should be a mystic. But that's sort of taken for granted, I think, in the East in a way that it's not in the West. That's not to say that people don't have their own private devotions and mysticism and things like this. But in the East, I don't know how to answer the question about what's the difference philosophically, other than that the schools of mysticism, I'd say the school of mysticism in the East is more robust in the sense that it's a long tradition. The Philokalia is a long tradition of people saying the strange things, strangely the same things about mysticism. Yeah. But I love the emphasis on the heart and on the person of Christ.
It's interesting what you say about spiritual pride, right? That's always something that in Catholic philosophy, you're always told to watch out for pride.
Yeah.
Where, say, in the Roman tradition, being proud was a virtue. Right?
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
It was something to ascribe to, not something to fear.
Yeah. Aristotle calls in, I think it's Nicomachean Ethics 5, maybe? 4. Pride, megalopsychia, having a big mind or big psyche, and he would say if you deserve great things and you don't honor that, you're micropsychia. You have a small mind. Your small mind. So humility was a terrible thing.
So you're getting what you deserve.
Yeah, and if you deserve great things, you should want that you deserve great things, and you should want the recognition of this kind of thing. And so now there's some truth to that to a certain degree. You don't want to be false or have false humility, but yeah, that was not anything that was lauded as a virtue, that you would be humble, or that pride was a good thing. You should be proud. Matter of fact, reputation and that kind of thing was very important in the ancient world. Yeah.
And I mean, Christianity was very much against that.
Oh yeah. It's sort of the idea that one would. I mean, back to the point about the crucifixion, that God would empty himself and take the form of a slave and that kind of thing. Is what it says in Philippians 2. Be found in the likeness of human beings and suffer like that, and just the whole story from the beginning is very ironic. Here's the God of the universe. It's sort of like this. I mentioned this in Intro to Philosophy, that in the wisdom traditions all over, the wise person always comes almost like Yoda, hides his wisdom. And he tests Luke Skywalker. Well, God is doing that from the beginning in the Christian. He's born in a barn among shepherds. He's born in Galilee, in Nazareth. He's born among the Jewish people who are occupied by the Romans. He doesn't, and so he's a Galilean. He's killed in 3 years, and he's killed and humiliated. His life was not one of pride. He was meek and humble of heart. And so that it does change. It inverts the entire system, which is what Nietzsche, by the way, back to Nietzsche, he found so repulsive about the Christian tradition, that it takes what's weak and lowly and lauds it as the highest. So like the famous Paul quote that he says in 2 Corinthians, "Cum vero infirmum tunc potent sum." When I'm weak, then I'm strong. That's Nietzsche would say, what? That's only something a loser would say, But yeah.
What do you think is the role of, say, story in the Catholic intellectual tradition? So by this I mean, say something like the works of C.S. Lewis, or you even mentioned Star Wars, which is probably, Star Wars might be the most understood metaphors in our common culture, or Harry Potter, or Lord of the Rings, right? So C.S. Lewis was probably the most overtly Christian.
Yeah.
But certainly Tolkien was a Catholic, and felt that there was no story, that people needed a story to understand these philosophical implications.
Yeah.
So how do you view the use of story?
I think it's a very effective way. I think most people don't want to sit and read Thomas Aquinas. Why didn't God just write? I mean, the Bible is a collection of stories. Jesus taught in stories, parables. He could have, I guess, just preached the Summa from cover to cover, which, by the way, Thomas said at the end of his life, it's all, junk, it's all straw, yeah. But yeah, I think stories cut right to the point, and it gives us a way of relating emotionally to things. It's hard to relate emotionally. I mean, maybe if you're like us, you want to read the Summa and you'll get a burning in the bosom. But most of the time, you could watch Star Wars or the Marvel universe is what people are relating to now, or obviously Tolkien, and you get that sense of, I'd say, two things: the battle between good and evil, and the victory of good over evil, and the sense of this idea that. Goodness and weakness, and I don't mean weakness in a bad sense, but that someone who doesn't have this, if you're not a Roman gladiator, you can still triumph over evil, and it gives people meaning and purpose. One of the things I hate about tragedies is, and Nietzsche loved tragedy. His first book was The Birth of Tragedy. Tragedy, he said, made you feel just the nausea of existence and the pointlessness of existence, because I guess it's all suffering and there's no point, but at least it's beautiful. Whereas I don't like tragedies. I mean, I suppose you can find the beauty in a tragedy, but the Christian story, which is told through stories like Star Wars, or at least I would say the first 6 Star Wars, maybe not the first 3 rather, because the prequels end in tragedy. I'm not sure what the last ones do. They have the triumph of good over evil and a happy ending. So Kierkegaard says this, by the way, too. If you believe in God, that's the only way comedy is possible. Not comedy in the sense that it includes humor, but the idea of the happy ending. So, whereas because there's a way out, there's an afterlife, there's a way out of this mess. Whereas if there's no way out of this, it's a tragedy. This sucks. I don't care. I don't care if you say, well, I could find meaning. That's not very fun for me. If I have to find the meaning and it's not really there, that's like saying, well, it's like being in a marriage or something and knowing the other person doesn't really like you, but you're just selling yourself that, or you're deluded. You're not. I think it's just interesting. But yeah, I think story is much, I'd say, more important or as important as philosophy and intellectual exercises to get at the truth. Now, I think human beings are philosophical by nature, and that there's that philosophical itch in every human being that will always ask questions that want clear philosophical answers. But story can be a way of giving it to people emotionally rather than intellectually.
So which stories from literature or film most speak to you?
Well, aside from the New Testament?
Yes,
well, I like Star Wars. I like I don't really read a lot of literature or a lot of so I'm strange like this. I'll read poetry. I like poetry, but I don't read a lot of stories. I don't have the patience for them. I'd rather read, even strangely, I agree most with Plato, but I read more Aristotle because Plato does the dialogue, and I want just the truth given to me clearly. But I'm trying to think of stories from
you want to cut right to the chase.
Yeah, I get, I like some stories here and there, but obviously I'll watch the movies. I'm trying to think. I don't know, none are coming to mind. I sort of scratch my artistic itch, or the art itch, with poetry. I like poetry a lot. Yeah.
So who would you say is your favorite poet?
Gerard Manley Hopkins, definitely. Oh. Yeah, and then Gerard Manley Hopkins. I didn't like poetry until I read Gerard Manley Hopkins. I'm like, oh my God, this is beautiful, and it's about God. And one of my favorite poem is As Kingfishers Catch Fire. It's beautiful, where he says, Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes, not his, to the Father through the feature of men's faces. It was very beautiful. I like Shakespeare, obviously. And then I like the German romantic poets, like Hölderlin and, who's the other guy I'm thinking of? Novalis, very good. Yeah, although Hölderlin has a beautiful poem in German. It's called Da ich ein Knabe war, when I was a young boy, and it describes his loss of faith, and it was very sad. He was talking about when he was a child, he believed in God, he would play out in the sun, and he was under the God, and then it all just went away, and he just lost his faith. It's very moving. So I relate more emotionally to poems, partly because they're shorter, and I don't have the patience to read a novel. But yeah. I've read Tolstoy and stuff like that. I like shorter ones like Ivan Illich, and that's good. I like Flannery O'Connor. What I've read of her, she's very good.
I think the story of Flannery O'Connor are more difficult for the average person to find the Catholicism in, even though she was overtly Catholic.
Yeah.
And in a very Protestant world. She was coming from the American South.
Yeah.
But I think you could read her stories several times without really finding the Catholicism.
There's a strange meaning. Well, it's funny. There's a strange redemption in her stories, but it's not always like you're like, I guess that's redemption. It's kind of a dark redemption, though, Yeah. But something happens. There's always a kind of conversion redemption. Yeah. Yeah. So
there was a Jesuit at the University of Scranton who knew her.
Oh, wow.
And J.J. Quinn. I don't know.
Yeah.
He wrote extensively on her.
Really?
And had met her several times. Sure.
Wow.
Too bad he's passed.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Had a nice discussion with him.
She, by the way, I don't know if this is true or not. A friend of mine told me this, that she kept a copy of the Summa by her bed that she would read every night.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I don't know.
To try to help her fall asleep?
I don't know. I guess she'd get her way through it, yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, so I do that, by the way, or you did that in grad school. Yeah.
So which philosophers do you like to read best? So now I'm not saying the ones that you agree with. Right?
Oh.
Because, sometimes you take great delight in reading something you completely disagree with.
Yeah.
So that you could...
That is, again, I'll say this again, that is a lost virtue, I think, of listening and talking to and reading things you disagree with. I get this problem with students, though. They don't want to hear opinions that they disagree. So I have to put in my syllabus now, listen, we're going to talk about things you're not going to agree with everything I say or somebody says. Maybe not even me, maybe not even the philosopher, maybe somebody in the class. You can't expect to go through the world just getting your opinion all the time like you're in some echo chamber. It's bizarre. Then you're not in reality. You're in a reality shape. My favorite philosopher to read at the moment is Nietzsche. And I disagree with pretty much everything he says, although I do tell students he's like 100% right 70% of the time, because he does describe human sinfulness very well, and he does describe this, he describes the way the world would work without God, but I find him to sharpen my faith, because I think these are all the reasons I believe in God. The idea that, like, for example, Nietzsche thinks mathematics, he's just wrong. But he thinks mathematics is just a construct that we use to control the world, and he doesn't really understand mathematics, as I'm sure you'd say. That, number isn't real. That the concept of number is just an invention to organize the world. And I think that's ridiculous. Why does it work so well? This is bizarre. Like, why, the unreasonable applicability of mathematics. I'm sorry, I just don't think this is a construct, Especially when you're the one who told me this, that a lot of mathematics isn't even applied, and that it can predict sometimes 60 years in advance. I think you told me this about the Higgs was predicted. We had the math before. That to me points to the universe being radically intelligible and mathematizable and these kind of things, because mathematics is real. I don't know how you understand that otherwise. I think that's one of the most powerful proofs for the existence of God is mathematics. Is mathematics real or not? Well, the mathematicians certainly think so. What are you going to tell them? They're just making it up downstairs? I say this all the time because we're on the fourth floor. I say the real metaphysicians are downstairs on the third floor, and tell them they're cooking this stuff up. They're going to laugh at you because they're, anyway.
I've heard the idea put forth that Nietzsche and, say, Sartre are the best reasons to believe in God. Because if you don't believe in God, then you have Sartre, and who wants that? Right?
Yeah.
When you used the word before of Sartre's famous book, The Nausea. Right? That basically, once you accept, in his mind, if you accept the non-existence of a deity, then pretty much the world is really just an awful, miserable place.
Hell is other people, he says in what's that called? I forget. We Close.
We Close.
Play.
It was the play he wrote while he was a prisoner of war with other people. Which
he
must
says,
have been a lot of fun in the barracks.
Well, I teach Sartre in my upper level classes, and exactly. He says there's no such thing as love or inner subjectivity. There's just domination. So all romantic love, and he says this will devolve eventually into sadomasochism. This is what he says. This is ridiculous. People believe in love. What are you talking about, people? And then, of course, Nietzsche. People who read Nietzsche and they're like, "Yeah, God is dead." I say, read the Antichrist. That's it. He's coming alive. Then he says crazy things in there, like really social Darwinian things. And Nietzsche, by the way, was a Darwinist, I think. He'll say, "Let the weak and the ill-constituted." This is from paragraph 2 of the Antichrist. "The weak and the ill-constituted shall perish, and I shall help them to do so. And the word shall perish shall go into the ground." And it's like the compassion, he's criticizing compassion and mercy because it preserves the weak. And he's like, no, Darwinism would have us let the weak die off. There's really no reason to do this. So there's Sartre and Nietzsche for sadomasochism and social Darwinism. I find them to be very now. The problem is students don't always get that I'm doing the reduction. I say this though, you can't possibly believe this, and I think it's very. It's a great argument for the existence of God. Yeah.
Sartre said something like, if you try to, the man or the woman tries to touch each other's hand.
Yes. Yeah.
What you're trying to do is possess them.
Yep.
It's not a sign of affection. It's a sign of aggression.
Right? Yeah.
Because if you don't have any idea of love, then everything has to be seen in this struggle to survive.
Yep.
Of the strong over the weak.
That's right.
So all these things that you know. Right, everybody, when you're 13 years old and you hold hands with a girl or something, and it's the thrill of your lifetime, you're not doing this to possess the other person, right?
No.
So I think that speaks to people that if if you're going to accept Sartre and the existentialists and that, the atheistic ones, then you're rejecting sort of everything that made you human up to that point.
This is the strange thing. People want to accept that kind of metaphysics because it's cool, but they don't want to accept the ethics that follows from that. And so they'll end up with Marxism, because Marxism is a nice compromise with that metaphysics of power and aggression and these kind of things, which is, the history of the world is history of class conflict, or the history of the world is history of gender conflict, or whatever postmodernism says now, because I do think postmodernism is simply neo-Marxism. It takes the critique of reason, that power is the way to explain everything, but then it wants to import sort of through the back door this idea, no, let's keep the Jesus, that's why people always say, I like Jesus' teachings, of course they mean, half of them or something like that, but
Dawkins himself,
yes,
he has an organization called Atheists for Jesus.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, he has an article he wrote on that too. Yeah, Darwin recognized this problem in The Descent of Man, and he's not actually. He kind of gets it, then loses it. That all right, well, what? Because he's aware. Wait a minute. Why do human beings take care of the handicapped or the elderly and things like this? Why not just let them die off? Isn't that more efficient? And he's like, well, we're evolved long enough. He doesn't really have an answer for this. It's a bad answer. Nietzsche just says, no, he doesn't mean that. Yeah. He follows the logic all the way through. But this is why I think Marxism is so popular today. Is it passes itself off. I think it's completely intellectually bankrupt, Marxism. Now, as a political philosophy, it's a nice ideal, but I think, and I guess, certain religious communities can achieve it, like the Jesuits are certain kind of quasi-Marxists, of course, and the apostles were maybe. But I think it doesn't make sense. If you cannot have that ethic with that metaphysics without or just you take it as an axiom, I guess. I don't know why you would. Nature doesn't dictate that. Matter of fact, it would dictate the opposite, is what you're saying. By the way, the part you were pointing to in Sartre is the part on bad faith, where Sartre talks about the woman on the date, because he says we're nothing inside, but we're something. We have this body, and we can't seem to synthesize it. And so when someone grabs my hand or grabs the woman on the date's hand, it's like forcing you to be kind of in your body, but you're not in your body, because you can never be in your body because you're nothing.
And he would go out of his way, like with his girlfriend,
Simone de Beauvoir,
when they would sit in the Café de Deux Magots, and he would tell her about other women that he slept with to show the meaninglessness of their relationship.
Yeah, that's and she was, I think, and now not to critique them for their biographies, but she. So I maybe I shouldn't say this, but you do a little research on Simone de Beauvoir, and because a lot of times I'd say she's the founder of what is postmodern academic feminism, second wave feminism, certainly. The idea of the distinction between gender and sex. She famously says, woman is made, not born. But she came under fire, in the 60s in France for abusing a teenage girl, and the parents got involved, and she was actually removed from her university position. And, it's interesting, should we not read, this is the big debate now, and a big question I constantly have coming up is, should we read the ancients, or anybody who has any kind of, anyone who's made any kind of personal error or sin in their life or mistake, should we read them? And I'll move that conversation very quickly to de Beauvoir, and they'll say, well, no, of course we shouldn't. Should we not be feminists then, or not read feminism? Of course we should. And I think, it's an interesting biography she has. Yeah, and Sartre. Yeah. So, they were in an open relationship, I guess, and I don't know much about it. I try not to read about it too much. So, but very good thinkers, in a lot of ways.
But again, that's the way I feel. I feel Nietzsche and Sartre both, their logic is fine. It's their axioms that are off.
Yes, that's right.
So that's what makes them compelling to people, is that they can make sense.
Yes.
But so they take their axioms, they apply it correctly, and then you get to this is a classic reductio ad absurdum. They get to results that are false.
Yes. That's exactly right. But that's why they're so powerful, and I think they need to be studied and read. Is because if you take the axiom there is no God, that's what results, not Marxism. You cannot justify Marxism. You can justify. It's interesting. Sartre converted to Marxism, but Nietzsche lost his mind. And there's debate about why he did that. I mean, some people think he was showing late stages of syphilis. I don't think so. I think he really believed this stuff, and he lost his mind due to his own philosophy. He paid for his philosophy with his life, I think, to a certain degree. But if you accept the axioms they accept, just the axiom that there's no God. I think from the axiom there is no God follows everything that Nietzsche says. I think he's right. I think he's the most consistent atheist. Now, of course, Nietzsche will say, well, since there's no metaphysical truth, if there's no God, then everything I'm saying isn't true, because truth itself is a fiction of will to power. So that means Nietzsche's own philosophy isn't even true, because everything is a function of survival and will to power, which some scientists, by the way, are now recognizing. There's a guy named Don Hoffman who says that we don't know reality as it is. Our brains are not equipped, if we take the Darwinian model, to understand reality as. As a matter of fact, we're better at surviving if we falsify reality. So that means that everything we're saying now is just a convenient, useful fiction so that we can organize the world, which of course falsifies that very, that's self-referentially incoherent. So that can't even be true,
That phrase actually appears in mathematics, the useful fiction, because
really? Yeah.
When they were developing calculus, they didn't have the definition of a limit yet. And so they would talk about infinitesimals, which they knew simply didn't exist in the real numbers, but it gave them the right answers, and they just referred to them as useful fictions.
Oh, interesting.
And until later on when they put it on rigorous foundation.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
And so it became something in mathematics as like, we know we're doing this incorrectly.
Yeah.
But we know where we're starting and we know where we end up, and it's all right. So there must be a correct path through this, even though we're using our useful fiction to get there.
If I wish more people could understand. I mean, mathematics is one of the things. I'll look at a paper you wrote, and it looks, I can't even understand it. Other things I could try to read. I'll go to the results and stuff. Other things in the sciences, but man, mathematics is so difficult. But I really do think, from conversations with you and you telling me what to read and here and there, I do think a lot of the discoveries in mathematics point to a lot of the stuff that philosophers are trying to prove, but you were sort of proving it indirectly. Like, if some of this stuff is true, like Gödel's incompleteness theorems and like, then I think it points to the objectivity of numbers. And if numbers are real, then we're into metaphysics. And if metaphysics is real, so it sort of proves Platonism, I think, to a degree. It proves the point of theism. Yeah.
Back to something you said earlier. I read this anthropologist once, and I can't remember who it was now, but she said. The true first sign of civilization, she said, was when she found a bone of a leg that had been broken but healed. She said, because this is what it means. In nature, you break your leg, you could no longer get food for yourself, you could no longer take care of yourself, you die. If an animal breaks its leg, it dies, period.
Yeah.
But clearly this person broke his leg.
Yeah.
And people took care of this person long enough for the bone to heal, and so that this person could then start to take care of himself. Now, there was nothing to be gained by helping this person out.
Right.
It was truly a human act, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't in your own self-preservation, because you had to give up your resources for this person.
That's a great point.
And she said that this is the beginning of humanity, which goes against the whole Nietzschean ideal, right?
Yeah.
Because in the Nietzschean ideal, you have to say, well, let this person die.
Right.
They're just eating our food without producing anything.
Right. But see, already there, then humanity is going against the sort of natural world and this kind of thing. There's a scene in Terrence Malick's movie Tree of Life, where one of my friends is a big friend. My former colleagues at Gonzaga, his name is David Calhoun, loves Terrence Malick, and he sees this one scene in there where this animal it's like the dinosaur age or something. That's what Malick's doing. He was a Heideggerian, by the way. He did a PhD in philosophy, never finished. There's an animal about to kill the other animal, and then it shows a kind of grace, and he thinks, oh, there's an evolutionary step there when human beings do exactly what you're talking about. Now, what's interesting is, I think human beings do this, back to talking about Christianity as the feminization in the good sense of the world. Not maybe there's a bad sense, but usually when you hear feminization, people use it pejoratively, but I think it's a good thing. And the human beings' infancy period, because our brains are so big, is so long compared to other mammals and other things. Human beings aren't really fully developed until you can't even survive on your own until you're 20 now, but you're not even fully conscious until you're 3, 4, things like that. So the infancy, but that involves a lot of nurture and a lot of care and things like this, and compassion and warmth and things like this. And that virtue, the relationship between the mother and the child, the mother-infant dyad would be lauded as the source of virtue. And I think Christianity does that, and Judaism as well.
And Christianity certainly uses that image. There's no more Christian image than the mother and the child.
That's the Christian image, and the cross. Yeah. So I think that's right. That I like that. I forget who. I've heard that too about mending bones and things like this. Yeah, but yeah.
All right, so can you tell us a bit about what your own academic research is about?
Well, I sort of got at it through, I can't stop talking about it, so it came up I kind of littered through this, what we were talking about here. But I would say I'm interested now in, or at least what I've been writing about. My last book was on a critique of postmodernism, because I see it as culturally relevant, and using Nietzsche and Heidegger and these things. And I'm just talking about, very simply, postmodernism. What do I mean by that? I didn't even define the term, I guess. Postmodernism, I simply mean post-reason or post-truth, a critique of reason. That's what postmodernism is. And of course, if you critique reason, power power is the only thing left, power or play. So it just becomes a joke or it becomes power. And of course, if power, then strong and weak, then of course, why side with the weak? And so postmodernism is this weird thing that accepts the critique of reason from Nietzsche and Heidegger, but can't quite accept Nietzsche's ethic that follows from that. So I'm very interested in critiquing postmodernism. Also, postmodernism as it just can't contend with mathematics. It just can't make sense of mathematics. No postmodernist talks about mathematics and the advances in mathematics, Gödel, things like this.
So what do you think they view mathematics as?
So
is that a useful fiction for them? Or
yeah, I think, absolutely. Just like reason is a useful fiction. Reason, it's an instrument of power. It's an instrument of domination. So all rational categories, as they're employed by science, which would be science makes use of mathematics, is to control and dominate the world, but it's not true. In other words...
So why do they think that the world has to follow mathematics?
They don't have...
Physics has to answer mathematics.
Yeah.
You can't have something in physics that does not obey the rules of mathematics.
So Nietzsche says in one of his notebooks that the intellect is like Procrustes' bed. You know, Procrustes is that Greek story where if you were in the forest, you'd stay at his house and you'd stay at his bed, and if you were too big, he'd cut your limbs off, and if you were too long, he'd stretch you out. So the intellect is like Procrustes' bed. There's passages in Bacon that seem to allude to that kind of understanding, that the world, like we squeeze the world into our rational categories, but they can't account for it. This is the thing. Now, what they use sometimes as postmodernists is kind of a tacit exemption of Kant's accepting of Kant's theory of mathematics, which is basically developed by Brouwer intuitionism, which I don't think makes sense. But yeah, they I guess to answer the question about math and physics, they would say something along the lines of the position is known as instrumentalism. The idea, which is you kind of find in Thomas Kuhn, the Structures of Scientific Revolution. So, and Kuhn does point this out, that you do have in the history of science false theories that worked. So I think they would say, well, science is just a false theory that works, and just like, I don't know, Ptolemaic navigation works, even though it's based on geocentrism. So too with all science. We have no idea what the hell we're doing. Now, what's interesting is we do have, there's some truth to that to some degree. Like when you get to like the quantum level, nobody really knows what the hell's going on down there, or how to interpret it at least. But you can move it, and you have mathematics. Now the thing is though, to critique mathematics, I don't see how you can do that. It doesn't make any sense. I can call China right now on this phone because of mathematics. Yeah. Like if to say mathematics, the universe isn't mathematizable. What's interesting though is it seems ridiculous to finish that sentence, but apparently there's a guy who wrote an article in in Nature in the 70s named Ed Tryon, which was later developed by a guy named Alex Vilenkin, who's been used by Christian apologists like William Lane Craig to argue for Christianity. But he argues that how can you have the universe come into being out of nothing, or spontaneous nucleation of the universe? Well, you can only have that if and only if the laws of physics are there prior, the laws of quantum mechanics. Then you can have the universe pop into existence, but the laws have to be prior. So it actually argues for a kind of Platonic existence of the laws of physics and, of course, mathematics. So I think, but this is how clever Nietzsche is. Nietzsche saw that you cannot take seriously mathematics and science and be a scientific realist and argue that the world is intelligible. And so this, without being a theist, because God will come in through the back door. Because what's the ontology? This is to answer your question too. Go back to what's my interest in philosophically or academically. I'm very much interested, and I've been interested in this question: the ontological status of intelligibility. What's the stat? What is it? What is it we're thinking? What's the stuff of thinking? When we think things, what are we thinking? What does it mean to think an intelligible reality? And I think that we can only think the metaphysical. If reality, why are we able to, not just why is math applied to the world, how can we think the world? Why is the world thinkable? It's just weird that we can reflect on it,
In terms of the Ptolemaic navigation and things like this, I think it works not despite mathematics, but because of mathematics.
Right.
If you have if you view so the Earth is clearly going around the sun, that's the correct model.
Right.
But you could view this, if if this were a visual component, you could see if one hand is going around the other.
Yeah.
That the sun is actually going around the Earth too. It's just your point of view.
Right.
So in fact, the mathematics of making it work when it was the sun going around the Earth in their model was significantly more difficult than the mathematics of the correct model, which is the Earth going around the sun.
That's interesting.
So the mathematics was correct, and that's why they were hesitant to change their ideas, because they said, look, we can tell you when the sun is coming up, where it's coming up on the horizon every single day.
Yeah.
We know all of these things. We could predict where the sun is. We could predict navigation on the Earth. So why would we change our model? But their model was clearly wrong.
This is an excellent point you're making. That it goes back to the point that you can critique science maybe if you want, but you can't critique mathematics, because the whole thing, I mean, to say that mathematics isn't real is ridiculous. Yeah. And you can, it actually makes it easier. Because I'm thinking of another critique of science, not mathematics though, of, Newtonian mechanics, that, obviously that's not true now. Of course, that only works. That's a kind of useful fiction to see, a ball going.
It works if we're slow and not so big.
Right.
Smaller than a sun and,
Right.
less than half the speed of light or something. Yeah.
Right. But the numbers work. That's the interesting thing. And then when they make it commensurable, so Kuhn's critique was that you can't make these paradigms commensurable, or only through difficult work. But when they're made commensurable, it's through mathematics. It's, how do you put F equals ma? You have to put it into some other, equation, the Einsteinian equation or whatever. But yeah, I think what's the irony is that, science is you cannot take science seriously and scientific truth without taking mathematics seriously, and you cannot take mathematics seriously without being a metaphysician, I think. I don't think there are any way to account for what mathematics is doing and the reality of mathematics without. And so this goes back to the question of the ontological status of intelligibility, numbers and logic. What are those things? What is that? And so, I don't think intuitionism can account for that. It's, Kant thought that mathematics works because we have these universal forms of space and time, and we work a thing out. So he's thinking of geometry. You work a geometrical proof out, and then it's true because space and time are universal categories of every human mind. But we don't know that applies to reality in itself. But of course, now with Kant's theory, the only way that works is if mathematics is always what's provable. And so, if mathematical truth is reducible to provability, which Gödel, of course, showed wasn't true. So I was watching a podcast a couple of years ago about, they asked this mathematician and philosopher, do Gödel's results affect, formalism? Yes. Logicism? Yes. How about intuition? He goes, well, yes. He's for things I don't understand, but I remember you telling me and teaching me about this a while ago. But for me, I don't understand. The question of what intelligibility is very interesting. Is part of my research. What is that?
Let me ask you this question: what do you feel that the role of philosophy is in theology? I mean, at one point, one would say one is the handmaiden of the other, whereas, say, at the New School, I think they should be divorced, right? Yeah. They should be on different planets. What do you think the role of philosophy and theology is, and theology and philosophy?
It's hard. So I follow Aristotle on this, and Thomas Aquinas, that, first philosophy is natural theology, that is the study of immaterial being, namely God, and what's immaterial being? God. So, Aristotle's book, The Metaphysics, he concludes what is being, qua being? That's the question of the book. And at the end he says it's God. What is immaterial reality? It's God. And so there's not a strict divorce. Now, depending on what you mean by theology, so I'm making a distinction here between revealed theology and natural theology. I think philosophy eventuates into natural theology and has to assume certain things about the metaphysical world. And if there's no metaphysical world, if there's no immaterial being, I think philosophy is worthless. I think because if there's no metaphysical truths, then we just leave it up to the scientists who, But of course, they can't give us metaphysical truth, because any kind of truth that you can communicate would be metaphysical. You can just give a kind of technology. So I think philosophy's role is essential to... and it always terminates in the theological, and it's the handmaiden of theology. I think that's true to a certain degree. There was something else I was going to say about this because it's important. Philosophy, though, it's interesting. It helped. So philosophy, at least the philosophical tradition that the Jesuits and the Catholic intellectual tradition most, I guess, abides by is the Western canon. The idea that you enter into a conversation that's been happening for 2,500 years, and it's very different from British Anglo-American philosophy, which starts from scratch every time. But philosophy is this idea: you enter into a conversation about the big ideas, and you see what people much smarter than myself have maybe not smarter than you, but smarter than me, have thought, and that. I think it's important, certainly for undergraduates at Catholic universities, to enter that conversation, because I said this before, and Plato says this somewhere in the Phaedrus, that human beings by nature are always steeped in philosophy. You can't help but ask these questions. Albert Camus says, the why will arise, randomly. When you're walking down the street, you might just be hit with, what am I doing here? Why am I here? What's the purpose of this? This is ridiculous. Every once in a while you'll be gripped with existential anxiety. You'll have an existential crisis. You'll try to figure it out, whether it's a death or whether it's death in general or birth, whatever. Mostly death for people. But eventually you're going to have to contend with these questions. And philosophy is about entering a conversation with very intelligent people who have been contending with these questions. Now, how does it relate to theology? I think that's the right answer. I think philosophy isn't just about questions. I think people get this wrong. It's about answers, and I think we have the answers. But the interesting thing about metaphysical truths and philosophical truths is the will is involved. You don't have to accept them, even though, like, I'll have people say, I agree with Nietzsche that there's no truth. And well, wait, you mean that even what you're saying is false? Yes. It doesn't make any sense, but people will believe in the ridiculous, So, yeah.
I think that the distinction you're making is important in the Judeo-Christian tradition. For example, in the Jewish tradition, an observant Jew would say that you, as a non-Jew, do not have to follow the laws of Moses, but you do have to follow the laws of Noah.
Yeah.
So that because that's, I think the difference that Aquinas would make between natural law and divine law, right? So everybody has natural law. But philosophy doesn't get you to, say, a trinity, but it gets you maybe to the existence of God, right? So philosophy would still tell you don't kill people, right? You don't commit murder, you don't do these things, but it may not get you all the way to what a particular religion, what Christianity or Judaism or something would say is higher than that.
Right. But it's true. That's absolutely true. And if you look at too, so this may be another. You're right. Philosophy cannot deduce the Trinity or that Jesus is the divinity of Christ from anything, but what it can do is show the openness to theism and to certain principles, things like this. It also ends up getting baptized. So if you look at the Church's dogmas when it was defining the Trinity or the Eucharist, things like this, it makes use of philosophical categories. Like Trinity is three persona in three hypostases in one ousia, or in Eucharist is transubstantiation, the changing of substance. So it uses philosophical language. So philosophy can provide, I think, religion with the tools to, and the categories, things like that. Yeah.
So on a slightly different topic, you've also written some books for children.
Oh, yeah.
Which is not usual for an academic,
Yeah.
not usual for any academic, let alone a philosopher.
Yeah.
So could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I wrote 3 academic books. No one read them. I wrote 6 children's books. Everybody likes these. They're
Probably more people have read your one children's book that have read all of my publications and your publications.
I know, isn't it? Yeah. And, there's 10 words a page. But it's very difficult to distill, philosophical thinking, particularly someone like Aristotle, Descartes. It was very hard to distill that down to something a child could understand. But I think philosophy, see, the thing about children, so I wrote a book series called Big Ideas for Little Philosophers. There's a box set. There's 6 books total. And it's trying to, initiate, I guess maybe it's a bad word, but expose children to philosophical ideas and philosophy and the activity of thinking. See, the thing is, though, children are natural philosophers. They're, philosophy begins in wonder, says Plato and Aristotle. Children are naturally asking questions, why, constantly. We have to beat it out of them. And so I think the books have been successful precisely because of that. That children want to know why we're here, what we're doing here, who am I, at least, these are the first questions I remember asking. Although, it's kind of like the question people always ask me, why did you become a philosopher? I'm like, why didn't you? Aren't you obsessed with this stuff? I was since I was 2. But, it's trying to expose children to some of the great ideas. But the one on Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, that one it was pretty difficult to get that one. But I think it works. I forget exactly how I did it, but something about if you're thinking, then you must exist. If you're imagining, you must exist, because...
So what do you see as the role of philosophy in education? I mean, today's modern world, if you look at higher education in the United States of America, very few students take philosophy at all.
Yeah.
Many universities, even quality universities, don't even have a philosophy department.
Yeah.
And in fact, fewer students are taking mathematics, physics, philosophy in general, even though, those departments still exist.
Yeah.
But many people have gone through their entire college career without taking philosophy or mathematics or physics.
Yeah.
What do you see this?
I blame it. I blame philosophers. I blame the failure of this as a failure of philosophers because they've been, philosophers have been given a great gift to be able to study this stuff and to think about this stuff, and they just squander it with arguing that there's no purpose to anything and then there's no truth in these kind of things. It's really, I think, blasphemous in a way. What's the role of it? Well, the role of it's essential because anytime anyone has a conversation, so I was arguing, it's always a philosophical conversation. What we're having right now is a philosophical conversation. We're not having a scientific conversation. We're having a philosophical conversation. Political conversations are philosophical conversations. Philosophy can help people. It helps people think straight. It helps people think logically and consistently. And so much, the thing is, everyone's going to, I say this in my first day of intro class, everyone has a philosophy and is going to have a philosophy. Are you going to have a philosophy that you received from somebody else unthoughtfully, and coupled with a bunch of strung together cliches, like everything happens for a reason, or, or are you going to have sat down and thought about these issues and these things, what you think and what you value in a disciplined manner, and entered the great conversation? So that's the problem with it, is philosophy is not going to go away. It's just going to become radically unthoughtful, and people aren't going to realize that they're doing it, and it's just going to be the people in power, or whoever controls the sort of mob at the moment, whether it's the Twitter mob or the virtual mob or whatever. They're going to be dictating people's philosophical outlooks, or scientists who aren't trained in philosophy. I'll talk to so many scientists. So, for example, I got into an argument the other day with a scientist who was saying why what I do is pointless. I get this; they just come up to me randomly and say, what you do is ridiculous, and I'll say, nice to see you too. But then they proceed to get into a philosophical conversation with me about why philosophy is pointless and why science is important. But they're not doing science then; they're doing philosophy of science. And so, anytime you have anything that extends beyond the scientific method, or you're doing mathematical proofs and things like this, you're doing philosophy.
So they don't recognize that they're doing philosophy?
They don't. They think, I don't know what they think they're doing, but it's not anytime you start interpreting your work or interpreting these, you're doing philosophy. And so.
So if you take a look at things like that only practical things have meaning.
Yeah.
Right. Then you can eliminate. You can eliminate poetry and literature and philosophy. I mean, what are you going to be left with? Why don't we just become a trade school?
Right. But the great disappointment and irony here is that all the great scientists of the past were philosophers. Even Heisenberg has a book on philosophy. Einstein read philosophy. Newton. Leibniz. Descartes. Just keep going. They read philosophy. They were educated in it, and people just. I think it's a failure of the universities and the philosophy departments because they're not educating scientists in it. They just think it's ridiculous. Because I blame in America at least, and in Britain, I blame the Anglo-American tradition, particularly analytic philosophy, because it tries to be a kind of weird science, and it's not. And so the scientists look at that and say, well, we can do that better. And they're right. They can do that better. They can do science better than non-scientists, But as far as thinking about non-empirical truths in a rigorous and disciplined way, I don't know how else you do it. Because I just find so many people who haven't studied philosophy, they make mistakes, amateur mistakes that you would clear up pretty quickly in probably the first week of a philosophy class. Like, for example, when people say, well, it's all relative. It's like, well, is that relative? Or it's all perception. Well, is that a perception? Or the stuff that Plato dealt with very early on in the dialogues. Or it's all contextual. Well, is that contextual? And in which case it wouldn't be contextual, because that would be contextual, that all things are contextual. So just that argument, the paratrope in Greek, the turning of the tables, or the self-reference argument that you learn day one, or relativism. The problems with that, problems with naturalism, stuff like that.
So do you think philosophy will reassert itself in the academic world, or are we doomed?
I have no idea. I don't know. I don't know. I have hopes.
I mean, this has happened so many times throughout history where they say we're only going to learn the practical things.
Yeah.
And of course, then everything collapses.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just like when they say we're not going to learn pure mathematics. We're just going to learn mathematics that's applied. But then it's been a disaster so many times.
Really? Yeah.
It's fell apart so many times. Even the communists said this, right?
Really?
That we only important knowledge is practical knowledge.
Yeah.
But you don't get the practical knowledge without the theoretical knowledge. You don't get applied mathematics without pure mathematics.
Yeah.
You don't get great writers without philosophy.
Yeah.
Right. You don't get any of the you don't get, so they would want, say, only political writing. Well, you don't get good political writing without somebody who writes a nice story.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? And as you said before, I mean, Star Wars affects the national idea of what is true and false much more than almost anything else. Yeah. Right? There's almost nothing that has the power of these movies that have been seen by everybody.
Yeah.
Right? So the notion of a Jedi, what is truth for the Jedi, impacts people more than probably anything else they've read, right? Even more than their entire education.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, you can't divorce, you can't just say we're only going to do things that have a practical application just today. Because you don't know what's going to have a practical application 50 years from now. But anyway, the thinking doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the worst part about that is people will start just taking certain opinions as self-evident opinions. actions. Like, for example, now, like I was talking about the social justice ethic. Well, I think that's true, but that's not self-evident. It wasn't for a long time, and you're just taking that because it's been passed on by tradition. But what happens when you're in the wrong culture? Like what happens when you're in Nazi Germany and there's no way to think yourself out of that? Or what happens when you're in a violent culture? Or whatever happens in this world, the way this culture is going. Yeah, and so, or like just look at the things, the discourses that are happening now with regard to, some of the identity politics, race, gender, sex, these kind of things. It's really, it very much is one. There's a lot of nuance to these discussions, and there's a lot of philosophical conversation. The philosophical conversation has been going on for at least the last 50 years with regard to these topics, feminism, things like this. But if you object or have a different opinion or slightly ask it, ask, well, wait a minute, what does that mean? People get very offended, and you're not supposed to question this stuff. They want to take it as self-evident. It's not self-evident even to the thinkers who originated these ideas. So for example, this is a controversial topic, but hopefully I'll explain it well. The idea that second wave feminism begins with the idea that gender and sex are distinct, that behavior isn't dictated by biology, which is actually influenced by Sartre by way of Beauvoir, that our essence is afterwards. We decide our essence because our existence precedes our essence. Okay, then some in the 60s, 70s, people start talking about not only is gender constructed, but so is biological sex. All right, but what do they mean by that? Well, if you read thinkers like Judith Butler or Shmulya Firestone about biological sex being constructed, Wittig, I think Monique Wittig, they'll say, well, that's because all of reality is constructed, and science is bogus. Scientific categories aren't real; they're just useful fiction. So, in other words, to accept that, you have to accept the critique of science, and people just don't want to. They want to just take things because it's sort of in fashion right now and in vogue to think this, but understand what you're doing when you do this. These people were very rigorous thinkers, and they knew what they were saying when they were saying that, and they were willing to accept the logical conclusions of what they're saying. So this is just an example there where people are, and so I try to do this in some of my classes. In my postmodernism class, we'll try to talk about, all right, what's the argument here? Because this is very much a philosophical debate that's seeped into the mainstream world. With the advent of social media, people are having bad philosophical conversations online and screaming at each other. And so I think philosophy is so necessary to be able to think through the implications of some of these axioms.
Well, that's what I think. They're trying to make their opinion an axiom.
Yes, exactly. And it's not. It's a conclusion derived from another axiom that they don't realize. Yeah. Or that axiom has implications that you're not willing to accept.
Which is very difficult. But I think the irony is that people on one side will say the other side is taking their opinions and making them axioms, and they don't recognize that their opinions are making them axioms too, right?
Yeah.
It's
absolutely.
A failure to see the other person, as you said right from the beginning. Reading people you disagree with is a necessity.
You have to.
If you want to challenge your own ideas, and you want to really, even if you want to reinforce your own ideas, you have to see the other argument.
Yeah.
And you be able to decide why you disagree with the other argument, and not just throw it out.
And usually there's a point to the other argument. So I can't tell you how many times I've heard, don't listen, this person's nuts, and I'll listen to them or read something, and I'll think, well, I see where they're coming from. I may disagree here, but this is more nuanced than just a sort of caricatural straw man version of it. Yeah.
I mean, that's the fundamental flaw, I think, of today's discussions.
Yeah.
Is they make a straw man of the opponent.
Yeah.
Immediately.
Yeah.
And they attack the straw man, and without ever attacking the fundamental thought that the other side brings to the table.
Yeah, and absolutely. And some of the strangest stuff going on now where we want to censor speech. So I think my worry with that is, in Greek, speech and thought are the same word. So you censor logos. You censor speech, you're censoring thinking. And nobody would say, yeah, we need to censor thought. They'll say, no, speech. You start censoring speech, you're going to censor thought. And so that's very dangerous, I think. I think you should let people speak and argue and debate. And it's not an act of violence to talk to people, like violence is violence, killing people is violence, arguing with people isn't. That's what a university is for. It's just bizarre that we don't have that anymore. In the university, particularly humanities departments, and that includes philosophy, English, theology even, they're buying this idea that we shouldn't really question, we shouldn't really argue about these things. They're sort of settled. There's sort of taboo topics, and that just seems wrong to me.
I mean, is there a taboo topic in philosophy? It seems like you should
not
be
for
able
me.
to talk about anything.
No, you should be able. Not for me. Every time. And matter of fact, if it is, I'll go right at it. Then I want to talk about it. So and it's precisely because people aren't trained that they think that there's authors.
I think when you make a topic taboo, you're giving strength to the other side.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like telling a child, you can play anywhere, but don't look behind the couch.
Right.
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 The first thing they're going to do is go look behind the couch, right? Because all of a sudden you've made it interesting.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I completely agree. Yeah.
So what do you see for the next step in your academic career? What are you going to look at? Do you have any ideas?
No, I don't know. I'm waiting for a question here. Like they arrive. They come at you, and I'm still interested in postmodernism and the question of intelligibility. So every time I write a book, I've written 3. I have a problem, and I think I've gotten close to solving them for myself. So I'm always working something out for myself, and I don't have that right now. I just am trying to refine. Right now, I'm trying to. I'm still writing, but I'm refining the way I think best to communicate it because that is teach. So I'm refining my craft as a teacher and trying to think of better ways to teach this stuff. And articles and things like this will come. I was telling you before, I wrote an article on math. We wrote an article on math together, and I wrote one with a colleague of mine in philosophy. And I'm writing now a book of Heidegger's, but it's just sort of an interpretation and commentary. But I don't have the same. I think I'm still caught up with the same problem of intelligibility and Christianity, and for me, the question of God is an infinitely demanding question. It's like so I'm probably obsessed with that till I die. Yeah.
So how do you feel that your upbringing, both educational and non-educational, has made you the intellect that you are today? I mean, or the academic that you are today?
Yeah, I don't know. It makes me argue because I wasn't raised in an intellectual family. I mean, my mother and father didn't go to college. Other people in my family did. But since very early on, I was very curious. When I was a kid, I would always read the encyclopedias. There was no internet. God knows what would have happened if I was on the internet. I probably would be some radical or something because I would, thank God. But I was always reading as much as I could in science and things like this. And I liked school. I liked to read. I never liked fiction, though. I've only liked philosophy and things like that. And so I think it was just in me. But I think my upbringing balanced that out a little bit. And so I think it made me a better teacher because I'm able to relate to a person who isn't an intellectual more easily. So I was at my golf club yesterday golfing, and this guy asked me what I did, and I said, I'm a college teacher. He's like, what? He's like, what do you teach? Philosophy. He's like, you don't seem educated at all. And I said, oh, thanks, man. He's like, but he meant it in a nice way. Like, I'm not making you feel like that. And so
we're going to have to send him to this podcast.
Yeah. But yeah. Be interesting. What about you? I mean, because we grew up. I don't know if people listening to this know this, but a block away from each other.
That's right.
Was that just in you, or was that?
There were intellectual people in my family.
Okay.
But I wouldn't say we were an intellectual family. But there were people who were very well educated.
Yeah.
And my aunts were very well educated,
Mm-hmm.
and my family really respected education. But I wouldn't say we were intellectuals. Some people definitely were.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like an overriding thing of that. But I think that they respected education.
Mm-hmm. Yes, my family did that. Yeah, as well. Yeah. Would you say this too? Growing up in Old Forge, a small town, sort of salt of the earth people. When I entered academia, it's a lot of we're better than the common person. We're better than these people. And people don't say that, but there's a sense of that. But I think having grown up where we grew up, it makes me take more seriously the common person's perspective. That I don't just immediately dismiss it and think think everybody who isn't an academic is a fool.
So I definitely agree with that.
Yeah.
I think both you and I have a more down-to-earth view of things.
Yeah. And
we don't see ourselves as anything superior. In the same way that we didn't want to move out of our town and sort of separate ourselves from our origins.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Some people, I think, they want to separate themselves from their humble beginnings.
Yeah.
But you and I definitely don't want to do that. We like our humble beginnings. I would say that the thing that both you and I have that is most profound on our way of thinking is our love of family. Mm-hmm. And we both have very strong familial ties our entire life.
Yeah.
And I think that's affected our philosophy of education.
Yeah.
That we don't see ourselves as individuals.
Yeah.
We see ourselves as members of a family.
That's right. That's a great point.
And I think that's an extremely Catholic thing to do, which I wouldn't have understood that as a child growing up in a family.
Yeah.
But, we were always concerned with the well-being of the family, not just your own well-being.
Yeah.
And for us, as for you, family meant like third cousins and great aunts, and I mean people just really that other people wouldn't even consider you part of your family. We definitely considered part of our family.
Yeah.
Right. Somebody needed something, you did it.
Yeah.
So there was definitely an idea that it wasn't just survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
You were there to help your family. That was an important role.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. I feel most comfortable when I'm around people I knew and people I grew up. My best friends are people I knew since I was 5. I see them a lot. I see them a couple times a week. It's just that support system helps. I think emotionally too. Which is I think I find people aren't happy. I tell students, are you guys anybody happy in here? A couple of reasons. I tend to be happy because I'm around people that support me and things like this. So I think it's good. We're not meant to be alone. We're not meant to be individualized. Things like this. So it's very isolating, the world.
I think that's a very Catholic. If we're going to go right to the core of the Catholic intellectual tradition, is that you're not here to be alone.
Yeah,
we're part of a much bigger thing, right?
Yes,
and not just humanity. We're part of God's world.
Yeah. Yes. And absolutely. And my success does not mean, or someone else's success does not mean, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not everything's about a competition. The place works best when people can all get along,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's at really the heart of an educational community, right? A university is supposed to be a community of scholars.
Yeah.
And it works best when you're exchanging ideas and treating each other in the best possible way.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully,
and also showing respect for other people's discines, which obviously you sometimes don't get.
I respect yours, and every other one.
Yeah,
yeah.
But I think you have to respect the intellectual tradition and what people are working towards.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's largely Catholicism we have to thank for that. I think to a large degree because. A lot of these certainly Ignatius and the Jesuits and stuff. This is still going on. This is the thing that's I think in peril right now is what's the status of a Jesuit university? Are we going to diminish philosophy and theology and humanities, or are we going to put our effort into them, even if they're not useful in this sense? I mean, what does it mean to have a Jesuit education if you don't study theology and philosophy?
Well, I think despite everyone's continually talking about diversity, we're losing diversity tremendously.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Because every college is becoming like every other college.
Yeah.
As you said before, you feel that the new school court sort of creeping in here, and if every school is doing the exact same thing, we have no diversity whatsoever. If everyone is doing the exact same thing, that's not diversity.
Right.
Diversity is really saying, okay, you really want to focus on liberal education. Okay, you focus on that.
Yeah.
You want to focus on something else. Great, you focus on that. The universities should be different from each other.
Yeah.
Not just all cookie cutter images and only distinguished by the gigantism of their student center.
Right. There's an implication too about diversity. I want to say something about this that diversity isn't just differences in sex, gender, race. It's also different opinions, diverse opinions. I mean, because not all people of the same sex think alike. Not all whatever race thinks alike. I mean, this is the idea that we need more people like this. Why? Because they all think alike? Now there's or they mean they need to bring their unique perspective, and I think that's true to a certain degree. That people, who may have experienced the world differently, yes, but all truth isn't just a perspective either. So I think you need actual content to fill out diversity. I'm all for diversity, but I think you're right that when we push that kind of diversity to the extreme, it becomes, one viewpoint really. And what's interesting too is that there tends to be very little viewpoint diversity at universities. I think psychologist Jonathan Haidt did a bunch of research on this. That something like, there's hardly any. 85% of people at universities have the exact same political affiliations, things like this. So
that just means if it's 80%, that means there's no diversity whatsoever.
Yeah,
right? Because then the minority is even afraid to voice their
opinion. Right. Yeah.
And I always say my brother and I grew up in the same room. We were 13 months apart. Same exact parents, same exact everything. There's no thoughts we share, right? We disagree on everything.
Yeah.
Right? So, like as you said, just having the same, skin color and hair color and eye color, and it doesn't mean that you're going to have the same ideas, even though we had the exact same upbringing.
Right.
We look back on it in two very different ways.
Yeah.
and I think we've lost the notion that we want this diversity of opinion.
Yeah.
Right. So, like you said, so a philosopher at the new school might not read Aquinas because they think, well, that's a waste of time, and they're not going to read Augustine. They're not going to read all these great thinkers that got them to where they are.
Yeah.
Right. You wouldn't have their philosophy without Aquinas and Augustine
Right.
and Plato and Aristotle.
Right. And the problem is a lot of the newer philosophy is so parasitic upon that tradition that if you don't understand the tradition that you're being parasitic upon, it doesn't make any sense, you know. And so I saw that a lot at the new school, where people just read Nietzsche. They started with Nietzsche, and it didn't make any.
Which makes no sense because it's a reaction against something else.
Exactly.
It's like watching an avant-garde play without ever seeing other plays.
Right.
You don't understand what's going on because they're somehow attacking this traditional form of the play. But if you don't know the traditional form of the play, it's meaningless to you.
Yeah.
It's just
Can't watch The Godfather 3 first. You know? You know?
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Armitage, for a pleasant conversation.
This was great. Thank you so much. That was fun.